So welcome to the April program of the Savannah Council on World Affairs. As always, we are here because we are supported by our sponsors. Christ is one of our platinum sponsors. They provide us support all year long, and we are extremely thankful for their support. Planters Inn similarly supports us all year long. They host our speakers, which is really wonderful. It's a great location for them, and we really appreciate all they do for us in that regard. This month's program in particular, this program is sponsored by The Current. Over there, we have Meg Coker and Susan Catron, everyone knows here, and we greatly appreciate their support. They are always there in the background, even if you don't see them. And if you don't subscribe to The Current, and who could not be interested in news about this area of the country, subscribe to The Current. It has really interesting, great coverage of our local news. Our upcoming programs are here. They are always available on our website. I would like to point out we obviously had a speaker for May. Unfortunately, things happen, and that speaker for May suddenly cannot attend in May. So our program director wants to say something.
I just want to say you'll be hearing very soon about the May program, but I do just want to tell you that I just got a message today that maybe as we fill out the fall program, it will now include one of our former ambassadors to Venezuela, and to talk about U.S. Latin American. He's a co-professor of mine at Georgia Tech now, Charles Shapiro.
Okay. Yeah, we are never short of excellent speakers because we have a great program director. So please appreciate all that he does for us as well. So next, I would like to introduce my colleague, Jerry Thomas, who is going to talk about a fairly new activity that we are participating in these days.
Thank you, Jennifer. So the main reason most of you guys are here tonight is to hear the speaker program, but SCWA historically has been involved in some other things to support our community. We have supported study abroad students for many, many years for originally Armstrong and now Georgia Southern and Savannah State. And so, and we have quite a few participants in those programs here from our board that are faculty at Georgia Southern. If you would, all of you guys stand up and be recognized. So I'm going to introduce the Jenkins students in a few minutes, but for the Model UN, Barry on the board manages the Model UN in Georgia Southern and Statesboro, and Yasik manages the Model Arab League here at the Armstrong campus. At Georgia Southern at the Armstrong campus. So, and also, for the first time, we have decided to get involved with high school students. And so we made an inquiry to see if there was anything that we could do. And Jenkins High School replied and said they wanted to travel to Chapel Hill to participate in a major Model UN competition. And so with that, all of a sudden we got other high schools interested. And so at all the high school faculty and students, please stand up. And before I introduce the students, Susan, would you please stand up again? Susan is the faculty advisor for this Jenkins students. Okay, Model UN team, it's all yours.
How's it going, everyone? Glad to see you all here today. Thank you so much for coming. So we're just going to briefly start with a couple introductions. My name is Caden Klein. I am a 3-year Model United Nations participant at the Herschel V. Jenkins Model United Nations Club, and I'm also one of the head delegates as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nolan Tanner. I am a 4-year Model UN delegate, and I am a co-head delegate of the Jenkins Model United Nations team. Thank you.
My name is John Limberg, and I am another one of the head delegates at Jenkins, and I have participated for 4 years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly Model UN is. Model UN is a extracurricular for high schoolers to get involved in international and political affairs by simulating the delegates of the real United Nations through competition. So how we work is there are two different teams, well, two different sub-teams. There are committee delegates and General Assembly delegates. General Assembly is often seen in the news. It's where the massive chamber with 300-400 people are. And then there are also committee delegates, which represent smaller but very important committees like maybe the Economic and Social Affairs Committee or the Committee on the Status of Women, just to name a few. And so what we do is we are each assigned a country and a committee, and we are charged with representing them to the best of our abilities while also getting the affairs and agenda of our country done. So, take it.
Alrighty. And so I'll be talking a little bit about our school's impact on the broader local community inside of Savannah, alongside one of the competitions that was actually funded by this very board, which I would just like to say thank you, but we'll get into more of that in a second. So our impact as a delegation and as a school has reached far beyond our own walls. For example, we have sponsored I believe 2 schools, including Woodville Tompkins and the Savannah Arts Academy. We have set a basis for them and have taught some of their students who have actually opened up their own Model United Nations team. Just 2 years ago, we were the only team participating in only some of the regional facilities that we have for Model United Nations. However, with the support of the Herschel V. Jenkins Model United Nations team, their wonderful students and their wonderful faculty have actually opened up their own Model United Nations teams that are excelling and are doing an incredible job at their own level with only 2 years of experience. Who can imagine that, right? That's incredible. And then, as well as this, I would just like to emphasize one thing as well. We have been around for quite some time, the Herschel V. Jenkins Model United Nations team. And so it's a very key thing that we learn and get new experiences. And so that's one of the reasons that we actually wanted to go to the Model United Nations Chapel Hill, was to actually learn a brand new things from other people that we've never met before. And so that was one of the very key reasons. Here, actually, behind me is one of the photos that we took. And this conference was twice as big as any other conference that we've ever attended. So think of over 1,000 students packed into this one room. Now, obviously, there were over 1,000 students in the same room at one time, right? But it was a very incredible experience, very insightful, and we learned a lot, of which we've actually packed into our own learning curriculum. That way we can actually involve other students as well. And then we're going to get started with some other things as well.
Hello again, everyone. My fellow delegates have talked to you about our past impact, our most recent expenditure, but I'm here to talk to you about the future. At Jenkins, we want to leave a legacy to our rising seniors, something they can work off of. To do so, our advisors brought up the idea of starting middle school level competitions to train these people in Model UN before they even reach high school, broadening the level of competition. Additionally, I've worked with Ms. Wallace, a board member here, on a potential new regional conference at Richmond Hill. Finally, and most importantly, we would like to advocate for the creation of a cross-school team with schools such as Jenkins, Benedictine, Woodville Tompkins, and Savannah Arts. To do this, we would each nominate our most talented delegates and send them to extremely prestigious competitions, like at Chapel Hill. Some of the ones we've considered are Duke, Chapel Hill, like I said, and UGA. Not only would this allow for more travel and more experience, but it would also make our fundraising efforts more efficient. And if the Savannah Council on World Affairs would choose to support us again, they would not have to choose between multiple very talented and deserving teams. Again, we'd like to thank you for all of your support and hope that we can continue to expect it in the future. Thank you again for all you've done for our team.
All right. As a former professor of international relations, I have seen a lot of Model United Nations programs. And these high school students are so, as you notice, so articulate, so composed. They think through their sentences. They have a thought from the beginning to the end of the sentence, even a whole paragraph. They can, give you a whole paragraph that's grammatically correct. It's really wonderful. And they're so interested in that. So moving on to our talk for this evening, we are so happy to have Dan Blumenthal here with us to talk about China, U.S.-Sino relations. As you can see here, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and is an expert on East Asian security and Sino-U.S. relations. He also had a long career in the institution formerly known as the Department of Defense, working for the U.S. government. So he knows a lot about the security in this area and has a lot of wonderful insights to share with us this evening. So Dan, I turn it over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Yes, I have a technology expertise, as you can all see. Well, hopefully I will match the ability to speak in full paragraphs and long sentences and stay with thoughts and so on. But we'll see. I'll let you be the judge of that. I did want to start by thanking all of you for giving me this honor of addressing you today. And I wanted to thank Larry, a terrific program manager, takes care of everything, and I feel very well taken care of and very welcome. And all of you for coming out. It's great to be here and great to talk to the World Council, Savannah Council on World Affairs. So let me get right into it. There's a lot to say on China and U.S.-China relations. And I want to get right into my talk and leave a lot of time for questions as well. I have, a lot of interaction with senior policymakers. I used to be a policymaker myself, and I served as a commissioner on Capitol Hill. A lot of interactions with members of Congress. And one time I was recently at the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii talking to the commander of the command, and I was talking on and on and on about how we're losing this competition to China, and he sort of said, you got to stop being so negative when you go out there and make your speeches and talk to people about China. I have this book that he mentioned, Graham Allison's book called Destined for War, saying essentially the United States and China are destined for war. The commander hates that book, for obvious reasons. We're not destined for anything. I do entitle my talk "Destined to Prevail" with a question mark, a big question mark. Are we destined to prevail in this high stakes competition? And you can judge whether or not. I'll try to make the case that we still can prevail, and you can judge how well I've done that. Well, while events over the last months clearly demonstrate that we're still a global power with global interests, we're heavily involved in the Gulf. We're still involved in Europe. There are global threats that are not just emanating from China. I think when we do talk about China, we have to say that we arguably face the most difficult challenge that our country maybe has ever faced. So obviously we waged a Cold War with the Soviet Union, for very many years, but and it was a really difficult strategic competitor to the United States. I think sometimes young people and others don't get a sense of how high the stakes were in that competition over Europe and Eurasia and so on. But this is different. This is different. This is different because of the commercial and industrial power of China. China, I argue, and China kind of argues itself. I do a lot of work with original Chinese sources. What are the Chinese Communist Party saying? What does Xi Jinping say? Is posing a systemic threat to the world order that we helped create. And the threat is economic, military, technological, and ideational over what the world order should look like. And I think oftentimes that piece of it is missed, that we're in a competition of ideas and ideologies as well, not just power. And one of the greatest threats we face, I think, at this moment in our national life in this competition is our own loss of confidence. Every generation we seem to face the proposition that we are in terminal decline, and we're doing so again, I believe, and we believe, I think, we're losing faith and confidence in our system and in ourselves for some very good reasons we can talk about. But I think at this moment, with a peer competitor nipping at our heels, that's a very dangerous moment to be in. What do I mean by posing a systemic threat to the United States? Well, if you look at Chinese documents carefully, if you look at the speeches of Xi Jinping, if you look at the guidance to the cadre in Chinese and so on, China is been looking to build for the past 30 years what it calls comprehensive national power. And that's across all domains of influence and all domains of statecraft. It's a term that China uses very often to measure scientific prowess, to measure cultural influence, to measure military and industrial might. And it wants to become the world's leading power and overturn the international system that it believes is very unfair to it, which is questionable whether it's been unfair to it. And let's be very clear, I talk about this moment of national loss of confidence and national doubt. The system that the United States helped create after World War II and after the Cold War has been enormously beneficial to the United States with all of its problems. More beneficial than I think its creators imagined. So this system that's under threat, the alliance system in Asia and Europe, the network of partnerships in the Middle East, the open trade and financial system, the freedom of the commons, led to levels of prosperity and safety unimaginable at the end of World War II. And it's very much something that China thinks isn't to its benefit. After the United States defeated the Soviet Empire and waged the Cold War successfully, it helped nurture the explosion of Asian prosperity and keep the international maritime system open for business. But it also enabled the rise of China, which is one of the contradictions. So the very system that the United States helped build and enabled all this prosperity and the rebuilding of Europe and the rebuilding of Asia enabled the rise of China. It actually might well be that the greatest mistake, strategic and foreign policy mistake that the United States made was to push for and allow and facilitate China's entry into this system. And for those who say, that the United States and China shouldn't be in a competition or that the United States should be more accommodating of China, the answer to that is that was the policy. From the end of the Cold War, or even if you go back to Richard Nixon's time in 1972, the opening of China, until about 2016 or 2017, the policy of the United States was to engage China, was to help China ascend, all in the hopes that a change in China's economic life would facilitate a change in China's political life, and we would converge in our national interests. That was the theory. When I was working in the Pentagon, that was the theory of the case. Differences with China were overlooked in order to facilitate and advance this policy. That was the policy of the United States, multi-level, multi-dimensional engagement of China to help it become a, quote, responsible stakeholder in the international system. But China had very different ideas about what it wanted to do in the international system. And that's not a result of anything the United States actually did to China during these long years, from 1972 to 2016 of engagement. It was, in fact, a wrong-headed assessment that Chinese leaders had at the end of the Cold War, that and during and after the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, the Chinese leadership decided that the United States was going to do everything that it could to contain China, to bring down the Chinese Communist Party, and that China had to fight back, but fight back in a very kind of systematic and deliberate way. We now know, unearthed documents that come from the early 1990s, the height of U.S. engagement policy towards China. We now know from the work of scholars such as Rush Doshi, who went through a lot of trove of Chinese documents that opened up, that China in 1993 began a long-term and deliberate strategy to use U.S. largesse for its hyper-nationalistic purposes, not to transform itself into a responsible stakeholder as we hoped for it or as we thought they might do. And we can already see previews of this new order that China has in mind throughout the world, from Africa to Southeast Asia to the Pacific Islands. The order will favor autocracy, and it does. It favors corruption. It favors mercantilism and spheres of influence, and almost certainly will result in more conflict. It's an enemy of liberty. China's Xi Jinping offers soothing sounding global projects as alternatives to Western programs, so named Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative. But a lot of what these programs do internationally is entrap poorer and weaker countries who have to give up sovereign assets like ports to pay debts. So it engages in debt trap diplomacy and really pushes countries in some of these development programs to give up very important parts of their sovereignty. Its security initiative, the Global Security Initiative, is really an initiative that favors autocrats around the world, that links up a lot of the most autocratic nations with China's incredibly effective high-tech surveillance tools. And you can see this in Africa, you can see this in the Pacific Islands. The Global Security Initiative has real impact. Chinese are training police, they're training internal security services, they're training cyber, they're setting different norms and standards for how to govern than the Western world, and really starting to have an impact without us really noticing or paying attention, having real influence around the world and building this alternative order. Now, I understand that many, here and other places and in China, say, well, the U.S. is actually the disruptor, not China. The U.S. is the disruptor of alliances, particularly now, and disruptor of the systems, and people have all kinds of views about the war in Iran, and we can get into all of that in Q&A. But really, when you look at it from a systemic level, it's China working very hard to overturn the system that I described before. What makes China different than the Soviet Union is it's also a very fierce technological and industrial competitor to the United States. That also makes it very difficult for the United States to muster responses, because there's a built-in lobby and vested interest in the United States that doesn't want to see tougher, more competitive actions being taken against China, because there's still big profits to be made in the mainland for corporations. So they're building up industry, rejiggering supply chains, putting themselves in a better position than the United States on many of these supply chains. And let me just go through some of the industrial competitiveness that China has achieved, just to give you some sketch of what we're talking about here. So today, China produces almost half of the world's chemicals, half the world's ships, more than 2/3 of the world's electric vehicles, more than 3/4 of its electric batteries, 80% of its consumer drones, 90% of the world's solar panels, 90% of rare earth minerals that we've all learned about recently, refined rare earth minerals. And they're not just sitting still. They're commercializing new energy, fourth generation nuclear technology faster than anybody. When you look at AI applications, China is the most dominant force in industrial robotics in the world by almost all measures. It has many more installed humanoid robots in industrial factories than the United States by orders of magnitude. There are 2 million robots working in Chinese factories, 5 times more than in the United States. What does all this mean? What does all this industrial dominance mean concretely for the United States? Well, it means a few things. It means that you can't import a critical mineral or a rare earth into the United States for industrial purposes without a Chinese license, which China has weaponized in various cases. It means that most American consumers cannot get their medicines without Chinese manufacturing of the key supply at the front end of the supply chain, or active pharmaceutical ingredients. It means that China is dominating the drone industry, profiting as a dominant supplier to both the Ukraine and Russia in this war that is continuing and has every interest in the war continuing. China will soon dominate most of the semiconductors that we consume, not the advanced semiconductors, which is made in Taiwan, but most semiconductors are not advanced, and China is building more fabrication facilities by orders of magnitude than any other country. You can't buy an EV or a solar panel without China's supply chains. It's very difficult to build a telecommunications network without Chinese suppliers. And China owns and controls still, despite a bipartisan act of Congress to put an end to this, and maybe it'll finally stop, but it owns one of the most widely used social media apps in the United States and around the world, TikTok. So, our kids and many U.S. users are getting a lot of their information based on Chinese-based algorithms and Chinese collection of data. I think a quick note on post-Iran war, just on the energy picture. I think China a lot of countries are suffering from what Daniel Yergin, the great energy expert, has said is one of the greatest energy disruptions the world has ever faced. China, because of its relentless focus on national resilience, alternative sources of energy, coal, is suffering a lot less, and its strategic reserve as well, and will be extremely well positioned for countries who want an alternative to liquefied natural gas and oil after the Iran war to be the sole provider of these alternative energies, because they made these investments in over the last 30 years in solar panels, in electric vehicles, and the whole electric vehicle supply chain. I think they stand to benefit, and they will benefit from a new energy order after this war ends. If anyone who goes to China and sees the level of electrification, can see for themselves that China's demand for oil and demand for gas is actually going down, quite a bit compared to some of these other sources of energy, which has made it quite resilient, to these shocks. Let me just. They did not get to this place by playing by the rules set forth in the World Trade Organization. They engaged in mass subsidization of industries and other brute force policies, brute force economic policies, subsidization, the stealing of intellectual property, and all sorts of talent programs to attract talent back to China. That's not to say that there isn't a great entrepreneurial spirit and scientific creativity, and so on. But the policies of industrial might and industrial power and supply chain dominance came from very deliberate sets of subsidization, IP theft, closing its own market, and favoring its own industries. Now, this industrial might obviously puts China at an advantage in peacetime competition with the United States. We saw very recently, President Trump in his second term came in to office and once again slapped a lot of tariffs on China. One thing I'd have to say about tariffs on China is that a certain level is very popular on a bipartisan basis. So President Trump in his first term slapped tariffs on China after an investigation into their trade practices, and that level of tariffs settled at a certain number. President Biden not only continued that tariff number, he actually increased tariffs on certain goods and items like electric vehicles. So tariffs are popular as a tool in terms of dealing with China's mass subsidization and unfair trade practices. But President Trump famously came in and upped tariffs in the second term to levels that were simply unsustainable. The Chinese were ready this time, and they basically said, well, if you continue with this tariff policy and a lot of your trade restrictions that you put on us when it comes to the export of semiconductors and AI chips and so forth, what we're going to do is we're going to hold back the sale and licensing of rare earths. And they won that showdown. I mean, no question. I mean, we backed down. So they were ready, for this kind of industrial showdown. And we took down the tariffs to a level that's closer to 23% on many of Chinese goods, and we're starting to back off on a lot of the technological restrictions we had put on China beforehand. So they were ready for an economic showdown with the United States, and rare earth is one choke point that they've weaponized very successfully. So the industrial competition makes things very different and raises the stakes in terms of U.S.-China competition, very different from any competitor we've had before. It also feeds the military machine in China. And let me just say a few words about the military machine. So of great consequence to our own national security is an astonishing military modernization program. Let's just look at the Navy, for example. China will add a staggering 65 vessels to its fleet in just 5 years, reaching a total that's 50% larger than the U.S. Navy. It'll be the largest Navy in the world soon. It's the world's leader in missile technology and has the world's largest stockpile of conventional cruise and ballistic missiles, and is increasing its nuclear capabilities as well, nuclear-capable missiles as well. But it's not just mass that it possesses. It is focusing very much on technology, quantum communications, and hypersonics. And as we can see, there's a small revolution in warfare going on the battlefields of the Middle East and Ukraine and Russia. And China, a key supplier to the Russians in this war, has a front seat at the table in terms of learning what the Russians are doing in the application of drones and electronic warfare and other forms of warfare that are revolutionizing the character of warfare. It's really a race between the United States and China as to who will be able to exploit this revolution in warfare more quickly and adapt more quickly. China may be the first superpower to capitalize on this revolution given its dominant position in AI and the drone industry. It also, I just sort of, to be clear, this isn't sort of abstract, China may go to war and use all these capabilities. It uses its military to coerce and rehearse for an invasion of Taiwan, to enforce its writ in the South China Sea, to build and militarize artificial islands throughout the South China Sea and other international waterways. It's out every day using its military power to coerce and intimidate and expand its defense perimeter, as well as to essentially take maritime territory. So the military modernization program is quite astonishing, fed by this defense industrial base, which in many ways has surpassed our own. So you may be wondering at this point in the program, where am I going to get to the optimism, and are we destined to, because it looks like we're in a lot of trouble. But are we destined for war? I mean, to go back to my original question, Graham Allison, the Harvard professor, posits that what happens, the reasons we're destined for war is we're the declining power, they're the rising power, we're going to lash out as the declining power, they're going to, this is what history tells us about declining and rising powers, is that they're always destined for war. We'll fight to the finish, to maintain our position, but we'll lose and China will eventually surpass us. I don't believe in destiny. We can avoid a lot of these supposed eventualities, and I'll mention some ways how. But interestingly enough, Graham Allison is very popular in China. They invite him all the time, and Xi Jinping meets with him. And this is Xi Jinping's assessment as well. And when we translate Xi Jinping assessment of the United States, at the last two party congresses, the 19th Party Congress in 2017 and the 20th Party Congress in 2022, 5-year party congresses where the cadre get together and they announce their big decisions, not just their decisions, but what they've achieved in the last 5 years. She emphasized in 2017 that we're already in a new era of great power politics, that China is well on its way to its modernization goals, and that it's going to start doing some things around the world commensurate with its new status as a great international power. In the 20th Party Congress in 2022, he said, we are marching to the center of international life, the center of the world stage, but we have to be ready for a long-term protracted struggle, his words, with the United States, because the United States has started to finally catch on to us and take measures to start to contain and suppress us. And he mentioned specifically some of the technology controls I mentioned before, and some of the steps we are taking in the Pacific to better our posture and so forth. But so we have to be ready, because the next 10 years in China's mind, the United States is on its way down, but it may start a conflict with us. It may start a trade war with us. It may suppress us. And so we have to be resilient. And as I mentioned before, they're showing during this Iran war that they are quite resilient. They were ready for things like energy disruptions and so forth. And they view this Iran war in many different ways. But one way they view it is that this is what the United States is doing on its way down, that the United States is lashing out on its way down. But there's a lot of defeatism in the story of Destined for War, right? Defeatism about the United States. And I get it. I mean, there's a lot of reason to be defeatist, right? I mean, people have all kinds of opinions about political polarization in the United States. We don't need to gloss over political problems we have. We have debt and deficits as far as the eye can see, declining working class, loss of sense of civic and social cohesion, all kinds of problems that the Chinese are witnessing. Eroded industrial base, a sclerotic defense industrial base that is having a hard time supplying weaponry and systems to ourselves and to our allies, and so forth. But I will say, and I do say this to my students, that we have been here before. This isn't the first time in our history where we faced huge problems in the face of a great power. I mean, many of you were alive and active in the 1970s. The Vietnam War and U.S. defeatism after the Vietnam War, the Soviets looking like they were on the march, stagflation in the United States, and so forth. And nobody could imagine in 1975 or 1976, which probably sounds like ancient history to many of the students here, that the United States, 10 years later, would prevail in the great power conflict, in great power competition. And the United States found in itself, renewal and the ability to renew itself, the ability to win a technological competition. The computer revolution at the time, the information revolution, surpassed the Soviets then, win a military competition, win an ideological competition. And so forth. So we have been here before. The question is, can we get ourselves out of our sort of self-doubt and political and social problems in time before the Chinese get to a position where it's impossible to catch up with them. There is a framework, I think, for how we should go about dealing with all of these China problems. It's a framework that President Trump. Now, President Trump and President Biden would never say they agreed on anything, right? Of course, I mean they would, they would disavow right away but they actually had similar China policies that had some of the dimensions I'm about to mention. Now, President Trump is undoing a lot of that. He wants a big deal with Xi Jinping. We can get into that in Q&A. He's no longer looking at China as a competitor the way he did in his first term and Biden did in his term. But some of the things I'm going to mention are some of the things that we got started on from 2017 till now, essentially. And here are the sort of 6 things that need to be done and we were starting to do. One is to decouple, so targeted decoupling in industries where we cannot afford dependency. The second is to deter, so prevent a major war or capitulation without war. The third is to not deny, and that's to deny China's ability to acquire and obtain allied high technology. The fourth is to defeat, and that's to defeat coercion and malign influence campaigns, which go on every day. The fifth is to impose costs, to really look at Chinese weaknesses and impose costs on those weaknesses, some of which we can get into. We've done a little bit. And the sixth is to rebuild. And I think that has a lot of consensus in the U.S. Congress and across parties, which is rebuild the defense technological and industrial capacity of the United States. So on the first, decouple, we of course are going to trade with China, but we can't trade in areas where the national security costs are too high. So critical industry where the U.S. needs to supply itself or get supplies from trusted partners, AI, biopharma, critical minerals, technology, and drones, we really need to decouple from China and not be dependent upon them for supply in these particular areas. Tariffs play some role, but they don't work by themselves without some form of industrial policy and some strategic trade deals with countries who are more trusted partners and can be alternative suppliers to China. The second on deter, we're losing, a war with China is a real possibility, unfortunately. It's something we all want to prevent. Deterrence is key. And building up our defense industrial capacity, improving our posture, pushing our allies to improve their postures is the name of the game. China may go to war over Taiwan, but they won't go to war over Taiwan if it's too costly, if they think the Japanese are invested in it and preventing it, if they think the Australians are invested in preventing it. If we have the capacity to respond effectively, we could prevent that conflict. And that sort of conflict would be so devastating to the global economy. We have to do everything we can to prevent it and to deter it. The third is defeating Chinese hybrid warfare campaigns that are going on every day. What do I mean by hybrid warfare campaigns? Well, and malign influence. Other countries like Taiwan and Japan know exactly what that is in terms of China's political influence and interference in their politics, but we have it here in the United States too. I don't know how many of you have heard of the case of Linda Sun. I'm just using one case, who was a key aide to the governor of New York and turned out to be an agent of influence of China. So what was she doing as an agent of influence as one of the key aides of the governor of New York? She was stopping the governor from going to diaspora events in New York that celebrated the Uyghur population. She was stopping support for the Taiwan diaspora. She was doing the bidding for money of the Chinese consulate, essentially, to influence our politics in ways favorable to, and she's just one case. And Australia has faced this. Australia, and you can strengthen yourself against this kind of influence through legal regimes, through transparency regimes, through investigative reporting. Investigative reporting is actually what broke the story that I don't know how many of you have heard of, that China was operating overseas police stations in New York. I don't know how many of you have heard that, but they were actually operating their own police stations in New York to go after the diaspora community that they thought problematic throughout New York. That was through reporting, really, that we found that story. So civil society in the United States has a big role to play in this competition. Fourth, deny cutting-edge tech acquisition and data collection. Very important to keep the pressure on. We're losing that right now. We had a program, I'll just give you one example, where we worked closely with the Japanese and the Dutch to deny China semiconductor equipment that they needed to compete with the Taiwan company TSMC to build their own advanced chips. That was a successful program we had of export controls with other countries. And China was set back in terms of their ability to do the hardware of AI. But again, these controls are loosening due to lobbying of some of our top corporate CEOs. They're loosening because President Trump wants a big deal with Xi Jinping. The next thing we need to do is impose costs. Look, China is not 10 feet tall. It has economic problems. It's completely dependent. Its economy is completely dependent on the export of all these goods that I mentioned. On the surplus goods it subsidizes, and the markets that absorb them. The United States market, the EU market, other markets when it comes to everything from automobile manufacturing to solar panels. So, targeted policies with allies that that impose costs on some of these Chinese exports, would impose a cost on the Chinese economy. China has geopolitically, it has 20 land borders. I mean, it's very much in the United States' interest to be friendly with many of those countries on China's land borders. So China has something else to worry about besides Taiwan and Japan and its seascape. So we can get more into how to do that in Q&A, but it's something people often forget. It does not have a favorable geography, actually, when it comes to geopolitics. So imposed costs is another thing we need to get in the business of. And rebuilding industrial capacity is very important, very, very important. We had, under the Biden administration, an act of Congress that passed on a bipartisan basis called the CHIPS and Science Act. Modest as a piece of industrial policy when compared to what China does, but it did encourage more manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. It was an effective policy at the end of the day. We can't afford to do that in too many industries, but when you couple that policy with the export controls that I mentioned before and some of the other tariffs and protective measures, you really can rebuild some of your manufacturing capacity as well. So let me just conclude by saying that China poses a huge systemic threat, but we still have some competitive advantages. We still have our alliance system. We still have, this may be shocking to some people, but in terms of wealth, in terms of national wealth, from per capita GDP, however you want to measure it, in terms of which country is wealthier, it's the United States by still orders of magnitude. The U.S. enjoys an overwhelming advantage. So household wealth in the United States got to $160 trillion in 2024. It's $85 trillion in China. So despite, we're far ahead in terms of wealth, China is very good at converting the wealth it does have into power and leverage. That's not something the United States does very easily. The United States individual rights, consumer welfare, great entrepreneurship, but converting all the wealth advantage that we have into military advantage and industry and supply chain advantage is not something we do very well, and it's expensive and it takes political will to do so. So while we face a country that and a challenge, a systemic challenge, the likes of which we have never really faced before, for all the reasons that I described. We've been here before in places, in times in history where no one could predict American renewal and the American ability to win a strategic competition. It's just that we have to take this very seriously. We have to get, United States. We have to have the political will and the political knowledge, to say that this is that what the stakes actually are in this competition. That whether we want it or not, that we're being faced with this geopolitical competitor that wants to change the system to our disadvantage. We can prevail. They're just a set of policies that we need to undertake, and we need to have the political leadership to explain to the American people why we want to undertake them in order to prevail in this high stakes competition. Why don't I end there and open it up to Q&A.
Thanks very much. Dan, can you all hear me?
Get it on.
Grab the one up right there on the desk.
Okay, I can't. The problem is I can't really walk around.
Can't wander with that one.
So I will try to fix this one in the meantime. Take a look at this. Thank you very, very much, Dan, for that great exposition. And I think what we'd all agree with, you've really explained what it means to be, what the U.S.-China competition means, but more importantly, how complicated it is to compete, how many issues, how many decisions we have to make as an executive branch and as a legislative branch in dealing with that. So let's open it up to the floor. Please raise your hand. I will come around and recognize you. Please keep it in the form of a fairly short question if you don't mind. And I'll try to bring around the mic, but otherwise just stand up and project. We'll go to this gentleman right here first.
Thank you very much. My name is Jorge. Some exposition, right? Earlier this year in Davos, the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said in a speech that the existing American-led world order is failing because of American hegemony, not in spite of it. And if the leader of the United States' oldest and closest ally is condemning the hypocrisy inherent in the existing world order, can you explain, A, how the system how the system you're defending is beneficial to anybody but the United States and probably Israel? And B, why a China or middle powers-led world order would be more autocratic and more conflict-ridden than our current one?
Yeah, well, I would say that if you look at the world order when it was being... Okay, we're off this? Okay. Okay. When you look at the world order that... when you look at Europe and Asia in 1945, and you say that one day these countries are going to get off their backs and be thriving democratic industrial powers, people would have laughed you out of the room. I mean, there was just simply no way. They were devastated. They were devastated by war, by World War II. If you looked in 1949 and you would say that the Soviet Union wasn't going to take over the rest of Western Europe or Eastern Europe, people would say there's no way. In 10 years we're going to be all speaking Russian. In Asia, after the Korean War in 1950 and the Chinese Communist victory, if you looked around and you said Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Indonesia, most of humanity, and India will be free and democratic countries that have developed, people would have said, you're insane. There is no way that will happen. That didn't happen in a vacuum. That happened because the United States provided for the security of these countries. The United States designed the financial system that these countries could join. The United States took the lead in designing the World Trade Organization. The United States opened up its market to these countries so they can rebuild. The United States created NATO. The United States created the Japan Alliance. The United States, even China. China's a very complicated place, but a Chinese entrepreneur that did very well in the last 20 or 30 years would say, thank you, United States, for your market, for the rules that you created in world trade, for your investment, and for your technology. There's no way we would have gotten to where we are today without the United States. So, Mark Carney and others don't like Donald Trump, and a lot of people don't, and I understand that. And they're, but it's just, you look at the data and you look at the facts of what the world was before the American order and what the world is today, and the facts just speak for themselves.
Present your question over here.
To what extent was it realistic? Sorry. To what extent was it realistic for the U.S. to expect China to adopt Western political values rather than pursuing its own model of development?
Yeah, that's a great question. Did everybody hear it? Okay. To what extent was it realistic for the United States to think that China would adapt Western values instead of going its own way and developing its own model? So I did say in my remarks that the biggest mistake we made in the 21st century was to allow China entry into the World Trade Organization. And that's the biggest strategic mistake we made because it enabled all this industrial power and the weaponization of supply chains and so on. Now, that said, China is 1.2 billion people, and there was a democracy movement in the 1980s that was crushed in China by the events of Tiananmen Square in 1989. And for those working on China policy at the time, it wasn't completely unrealistic to think, given China's economic reforms, that China would go the way of Taiwan, which transitioned into a democracy, one of the most vibrant liberal democracies in the world, that China might go the way of South Korea, which did the same. So for people working on these issues at the time, it wasn't completely crazy to think that the economic reforms and the entrepreneurship and so on would have the Chinese then demanding more political rights and political values. And there were those in China who did. Now, that said, that's not what China did, right? I mean, China decided, as I said in my remarks, that the international system was unfair to it and threatening to it, and that and that the party's interest, we're going to remain a autocracy. Thank you very much. We're going to centralize, particularly over the last 10 years, power in this autocracy, in this party, and Western values are threatening to us. That's the leadership. That's what the leadership decided. But the idea that China, would want more, that Chinese people would want more rights and freedoms and so on, I don't think was a completely insane one. It's just those who did lost a struggle with those in power.
Dan, over here.
If America is so afraid of the economic domination of China and is willing to use espionage to prop up our hegemony over Latin America, steal intellectual property ourselves, subsidize American companies like the $52 billion given this year to Tesla, Google, Meta, Amazon, and other American companies, then why isn't America closing the gap? And why is the EU continuingly to be more warm to China?
Well, I disagree with a lot of the premises, of the question. I mean, U.S. stealing intellectual property is against U.S. law, and so I don't know what you're referring to specifically, but look, China, as I mentioned in my remarks, subsidization that the United States did in the chip industry of $52 billion. I mean, that's like a pebble in the water compared to what the Chinese do in subsidization. I mean, China put entire industries out of business through subsidization. I mean, if you go and walk through places in Michigan and Ohio, you will see entire towns that were destroyed by Chinese subsidization of its industry, of steel and so on. So there's just no comparison. I mean, the United States, just to get a modest amount of subsidization in the chips industry, took a political battle, and it's a very low amount compared to Chinese subsidization. China's goal is to put entire industries out of business. So it's now going after the auto industry, and the German auto industry is extremely concerned that the subsidization of the electric vehicle industry is going to put German automakers out of business, and that's its goal. It doesn't want competitors. Rare earth and critical mining. Every time that the United States or other countries have make some move to open a mine or to open refining capacity, China underprices, right away under market prices and puts those mines out of business. So there's just no comparison in terms of what China does in terms of not playing by the economic rules in the United States. So I think, it really becomes a question at the end of the day. America's afraid of Chinese economic hegemony. I mean, you have to ask yourself, I mean, do you want to be reliant on China for every good and product that you buy? I mean, do you want to be reliant on China for every pharmaceutical that is produced? Do you want to be reliant on China for every chip that's made? A country that has this attitude towards us, and that's what we're facing at the end of the day. So we should be much more scared of Chinese economic hegemony.
I wanted to talk about clean and renewable energy technologies, because that's kind of been an emerging kind of field of competition between the United States and China. And I wanted to kind of talk about the deny component of the framework you were talking about, where we have to deny them this sort of access to cutting edge technology. My question would be, China is the undisputed leader in the world when it comes to having clean energy technologies, how can we deny them access to that cutting edge technology when they've already amassed such an impressive stockpile, and they have, like you said, access to 90% of critical earth minerals on the planet?
Yeah, they don't have access. They have the refining capacity for 80% of critical, of critical and rare earth. So the rest of the world, Australia, Japan, Canada, the United States, is in the process of trying to develop that refining capacity. It's just very difficult because of the market dynamics I mentioned before, the subsidizations. There's no denying China the technologies for solar panel. What the United States decided to do under President Biden was to tariff the importation of electric vehicles in the supply chain. And Europe decided not to do that, and Europe is practically colonized by Chinese electric vehicles and the electric vehicle supply chain. So, it's more going to be a question of in clean energy, China's so far ahead, the United States isn't going to catch up. It's other types of, it's nuclear power, there's still a competition. It's fossil fuels, diversification, where the United States is far ahead. But when it comes to clean energy, it'll be very difficult to catch up or deny. The deny piece that I'm arguing for is we had this framework where, because we're ahead in compute power on the AI competition, we had a deny compute power policy that is now being unwound, and that's almost entirely because of corporate CEO lobbying. I mean, there's no policy rationale for that.
Dr. Blumenthal, thank you so much for your presentation and this amazing framework you created. And what you talked about in terms of historical analogies and analysis of the current problems indicates that the way to deal with Chinese challenge is through a broad-based centrist consensus in the United States that you indicated actually exists as a potential in US foreign policy, and also through a broad-based global alliance, and that's what the Cold War was against the Soviet Union. We created a global system that contained and competed with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So how is it, would you assess the prospects for this type of broad consensus and also a broad-based global alliance against Chinese hegemony, which arguably is possible and arguably is the preference of most countries in the world? Most of them don't want to be subsidiaries of China. In the context of, frankly, President Trump pursuing his own mercantilistic, nationalistic, authoritarian project. So in many ways, a copy of what China is, and then, this notion that we actually don't compete against China, we want to divide the world into spheres of influence and bring the world back to 18th century realism.
Yeah, I think, so there was a broad-based consensus in the United States. I mean, we over the last few years, we passed on a bipartisan basis the TikTok bill, the CHIPS and Science Act. We started this select committee in the Congress just on competition with China. We had a broad-based consensus on export control and technology restrictions. We had a broad-based consensus on moving Japan and other countries around Taiwan faster on their defense reform, and a lot of that stays in place. I think what's unwinding right now when it comes to the technology restrictions regime is that, like I said before, there are people who, corporate leaders and corporate CEOs who still see a lot of money to be made selling AI chips to China, and that's breaking the consensus. I mean, they're convincing President Trump that that's the way to go. A whole other discussion, but I don't think President Trump has some vision of the world that's divided into spheres of influence. I think when it comes to China, he believes we're in a disadvantageous position and we lost the first round of a trade war. And so we have to be very circumspect and careful when it comes to the next steps we take when it comes to trade and technology restrictions. But, he still has policies. For example, his meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi and his encouraging of her to continue Japan along the lines of defense reform and defense modernization. We still have policies that are granting us more access in the Philippines. We just signed an agreement for access in Indonesia. Some of this is just continuing, right? It's not the way a lot of us would like America to talk or America to act, but essentially, these alliances are enduring. And as you said before, the consensus around it not living under Chinese hegemony is strong, and so the momentum behind some of these policies continues. Europe, I think, is the problem here in a lot of ways, because Europe will not take policies to defend themselves against Chinese economic dominance, right? And other countries India, for example, has taken a lot of policies to protect itself against Chinese social media apps, consumer goods and so forth. But Europe, for example, won't use the measures it has in place to protect itself against the absolute flood of clean energy and electric vehicles that is coming its way that will destroy its industry. So some of it is the way the U.S. talks and the way President Trump talks and acts. Some of it is that countries that should be taking actions to protect themselves are just simply not doing so.
We can't hear you back here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Good.
You got a question down front.
A few years ago, when I was very active in research and development, let's say in the last 3 decades of last century, it was extremely difficult to deal with the Chinese. First of all, patent protection was essentially zip. You could not get a Chinese patent. They threw up all kinds of roadblocks. They are also very interested in your intellectual property, and they do everything they could to get that. They do business with you, but strictly on their terms. I haven't really kept up with it. What has changed in the last 30 years?
Not a lot. I mean, success on the Chinese part in terms of the base of research and development. When it comes to biopharma, for example, I mean, real scientific breakthroughs on cancer therapeutics and CAR T treatments and so forth, real investment in R&D. So success has changed, but it's not easy to deal with. It's not easier to deal with the Chinese system in business or in research collaboration. There's still a lot of intellectual property theft. In some ways, it's more sophisticated. It's just that the last 25 years, the Chinese industrial and technological base has grown so much. When you talk to companies that are still doing and seeking to do business in China, and you say, they're going to use you for their purposes, strip you down, and then kick you out of the market. A lot of American companies, it's changed for the better, but a lot of American companies are still thinking very short term. Well, in the next few quarters or whatever, we'll still make a profit.
Okay, I have a question over here, Dan, and then I got 3 in the middle.
Hey, I'm going to be referencing your first response. In regards to that response about the importance of U.S. investment in the global sphere, do you think that those points still hold water when considering recent administrative actions, such as President Trump reportedly seriously considering withdrawal from NATO or the increase of tariffs on major trade partners like Japan?
I don't fully understand the question. So is the United States still investing in the global order? Is that the question?
I'm asking, do you think that those points about like the U.S.'s important involvement with NATO or their trade agreements with Japan are still relevant?
Well, yeah, I mean, the U.S. is still part. The U.S. is still part of NATO, right? So I guess the question is, given the fact that President Trump has talked about getting out of NATO and putting tariffs on Japan, is the U.S. still invested in the global order? Yeah. So yes, the U.S. is still invested in the global order. For all the other, we're not out of NATO. NATO, we just had the Secretary General visit and reinforce NATO's commitment to finally getting up to the defense spending standards that they promised, many years ago. That's very good for NATO. It's very good for the future of NATO. Certainly, the Eastern Bloc in NATO is actually, from Ukraine to Poland, to other places, is actually doing that. Is improving its defense posture and its stance against Russia. That's something we've wanted for a very long time. So, the U.S. is not going to pull out of NATO. It's just not going to happen. Is President Trump frustrated with NATO? Are there tensions all the time, like there have been with other presidents? Yes. Has NATO done some things that you have to scratch your head about when it comes to its defense spending, its defense investment? overfly rights and so forth for the United States, yes, there are tensions, but U.S. isn't pulling out of NATO. When it comes to Japan, Japan doesn't like the tariffs. I don't like the tariffs. The tariffs are going down quite a bit because the U.S. and Japan negotiated an investment framework recently, and so the Japanese are investing heavily in U.S. LNG pipeline in Alaska, in AI data centers, and so forth, and so the tariffs are going down. Japan is so reliant on the United States and investment in the United States, U.S. investment in the alliance system, it wouldn't survive without it. I mean, it just simply couldn't stand up to China without the U.S. alliance structure. That alliance structure is very strong. Japan is moving in the right direction on a lot of those issues. It's loosening its interpretation of its constitution. It's becoming a more equal ally. It's spending more on defense. It's integrating more with the United States. That alliance is going to be very healthy.
I got a question right down here.
How do we stand against China as far as intellectual capital, holistically? Because China, can you hear me? How do we stand compared to China as far as intellectual capital? For instance, China has a 97.3 literacy rate. In the United States, 54% of U.S. adults read below the 6th grade level.
Yeah.
So how does that impact? How will that impact us?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting a little beyond my knowledge base, but there's no question. I mean, I look at the output, and there's no question that China today, in all the industrial numbers that I put forth, and its industrial dominance in its AI applications, is doing in its scientific applications, is doing very, very well. I don't know specifically the answer to your question about literacy rates, and it's hard to get very good Chinese statistics and so forth, but clearly they're doing very, very well in terms of building up their scientific base, their technological base, and their industrial base, and that obviously has a huge educational component to it. One piece of that is Chinese studying here and now increasingly returning to China with incentive packages, but another piece of that is improved education in China, without a doubt.
Another one here in the middle.
I'd like to hear your comments about the Chinese influence in our hemisphere here. We know the Canadians are trading more than ever with China. We know that we've pretty much ignored the Belt and Road initiatives in South America, but particularly in the Caribbean, which is very close to home, whether we're looking at casinos and hotels in the Bahamas, whether it's the cricket stadium in Antigua, in Aruba, the grocery stores, the condos, the auto dealerships. What comments do you have about the Chinese influence in our own backyard here in the Caribbean and in Central and South America?
Yeah, a terrific question. I think that's something that Secretary Rubio and President Trump were very concerned about when it came to some of the decisions we made with respect to the Panama Canal and divestment from Hutchinson Whampoa and the Panama Canal. That was something very important to us. I think Panama's going to go through with that. Cuba is a place where the Biden administration uncovered listening stations and intelligence facilities of the Chinese. That's something to be very concerned about. There's no question that in the larger picture, the Chinese want to be able to affect, influence, hit our homeland like we can hit theirs. So that's influence in the hemisphere. Brazil is another place. I mean, China and Brazil will have a very good energy relationship, a very good AI relationship, very concerning for the United States. But it actually, this isn't your question, but the homeland of the United States is not immune to Chinese, threats either. So cyber attacks, critical infrastructure attacks through cyber. The Chinese want influence in the Western Hemisphere, not just for commodities, but because they want to be able to do to us what they think we're doing to them in their neighborhood.
This is rather a pessimistic outlook you're providing to us. Now, President Trump is visiting China in just a few weeks. What could or should be on the agenda there? And is this likely to have a meaningful outcome, a positive outcome for the United States, or is it more likely to cement China's position in the world?
Great question. I think the summit won't have too many outcomes. We're a little bit back to the future when it comes to our engagement policy with China. So, when you look at the statements of the leading economic secretaries in the United States Treasury and USTR, it's all about maintaining an enduring and stable economic framework with the Chinese. So we'll be talking about tariff landing zones and easing technology restrictions and getting licenses for critical minerals and rare earths and so forth. So I think it will most probably be more beneficial to China than to us, because China doesn't want to see us return to the competitive framework that I laid out before.
I have another question here in the middle, and then we'll go over to the other side.
Hello, good evening. Yeah, can you hear me now? All right. Well, the prevalent rhetoric about China has been very economic. And for the longest time, China has maintained, at least on the face of it, a policy of non-interference in global affairs. So outside of the South China Sea and the Taiwan situation, what do you think is a real possibility of this policy shift as China raises its defense and military capabilities?
Yeah, terrific, great question. As I mentioned in my remarks, if you spend time in Australia, for example, they will tell you and show you the data on how penetrated the Pacific Islands are. So what China has done in the Pacific Islands is essentially provide for the police and internal security forces. So the initiative that I mentioned, called the Global Security Initiative, which Xi Jinping announced, basically what he's saying is, we're not going to do alliances. What we're going to do is provide for your internal security. And so we're going to provide the AI and surveillance technology so that you can better stay in power and deal with your dissidents. We are going to provide internal security training. And that's something of great concern, but they're making headway in Africa and the Pacific Islands. They're not doing it the same way we are in terms of large military bases overseas. Not yet. There's some. Cambodia and Djibouti are two. But internal security, and then some of the Belt and Road initiatives that someone else mentioned before, which leads countries into a lot of debt. Sri Lanka had this issue where they got into a lot of debt, and essentially they had to give big portions of their port of Hambora out to the Chinese. So those are some of the places where the Chinese see that they can make some headway.
Two more very short questions, but
do people believe that China's waiting for certain parts of a puzzle to fall into place to go after Taiwan, or yes, they make noises, but they don't really care?
They care deeply. They impact Taiwan every day through political influence, through military pressure, through espionage, through subversion. Just this last week, they invited the opposition leader of Taiwan, who is deadly opposed to the elected government of Taiwan, to meet with Xi Jinping. And they're only going to deal with her, so they're trying to divide and polarize Taiwan politics. The question of whether they actually invade is dependent upon whether they think they can succeed, right? So if they think the United States and Japan and Australia and the Philippines won't effectively intervene and Taiwan won't defend itself, then the chances of invasion and occupation go way up. But they're dead set on stopping Taiwan from its existence as a de facto independent country.
okay, one last question. Dan, I got you over here.
With the recent launch of Artemis II by the United States, how do you believe that the race for technological advancements in space will fare between these two countries, the United States and China?
Yeah, excellent question. So China, government-based space programs and lunar missions and discovery is very important to them. They're the most frequent and robust launcher of satellites into space right now in the world. For us, it's moved almost entirely into the commercial realm. So our space programs are not faring very well from a governmental perspective, but we're trying to do what we can to leverage commercial space, which is becoming, a pretty big industry for us. But it's private sector based here, it's government based there, but it's something they take very seriously. Also weaponizing it for military purposes.
Thank you very much for your great talk and the great questions. Before our sponsor leaves the room, I want to say again, we are able to do this because of our sponsors, and I know all of you know Kreitz, all of you know Planters Inn because you walk by it all the time. A lot of people might not know about the Current. Please check it out, and I think you'll find it interesting. Also, I have something to say unrelated to our speaker this evening, and that is to remind you again that we are an all-volunteer organization, and we are always reaching out to our members to ask for help. And at this moment, I have two particular requests. Our dear treasurer has announced in January he will be stepping down, so we're looking for someone interested in becoming our treasurer. The other thing is our publicity chair, Becky Cheatham, who is back there in the back, is also looking for someone to help her out with that task. So if you're interested in helping us in any way, send an email to the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and we'll reach out to you. So a big hand for our speaker this evening. Thank you so much.